Hello, Darksiders! Welcome to another entry in the Villain Competency tier list, where we estimate the competency levels of villains from across fiction and put them on a tier list of my own making. Today we're going to be going over an entry I've been wanting to make for quite some time now. I think since around episode 2 or 3 maybe of when I started this whole series. And that, of course, would be the Mad Titan Thanos, the main antagonist of the initial phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the survivor of a population collapse who decided to use the confirmation bias of the catastrophe to save the rest of the universe from the fate of his homeworld by eradicating half of all life at random without any consideration for background, religious, social, economic, racial, and instead simply killing them all dispassionately in order to create a better, more sustainable, prosperous universe. Was he successful, and how competent was he in achieving his goals? Well, before we get into all of that, I think it's best to examine Thanos' background a little bit because honestly think understanding the background of these types of villains and understanding where they came from, their upbringing, and the events that made them who they are today are crucial to understanding why they were close or perhaps not so close to achieving their personal goals. So, Thanos was brought up on Titan in a noble family, but unfortunately, he was born rather disgruntled. He was born disfigured. His face was all weird and wacky. His skin was demented and purple, and generally, he was just seen as a societal outcast long before he began growing these Malthusian principles. We'll get into Malthus very soon in a second here, but first I want to go over Thanos' backstory. So, before he even started getting all these ideas of snapping away half of the universe like it was nothing, Thanos was already being treated as someone other, someone outside of the box, figuratively and literally. He was also the adoptive brother of a celestial named Eros, but that has no real relevance onto the story. So, I mean, it's just a little fun fact for you because I watched The Eternals recently. Honestly, I don't get why everyone's saying that movie deserved to have more credit than it actually did. It was an okay movie. I mean, I thought the fight scenes were pretty good. That's about it. Anyway, going off track. Thanos began seeing as he was growing up in adolescence and into adulthood that Titan was going down a path of instability. And why? Because the amount of resources that Titan had, its natural resources, the resources that were giving people life, food, water, electricity, minerals, etc., they were all helping the population too much. The population was growing beyond anything that could be sustained by the planetary government, by the planetary boundaries. And so Thanos presented a rather radical solution to the planetary government during the Senate hearing, or what we can assume is a what the equivalent of Titan's government Senate hearings. He proposed that the in a public forum, mind you, he proposed that half of the population of Titan dispassionately and at random would be selected for total extermination without any regard of the background of the individual or where they came from or who they were. They would be exterminated. Of course, at the time, this solution was seen as deranged and extreme. He was laughed out by the planet's academics and its ordinary citizens and governmental leaders alike, and he was straight up exiled from planetary society. I'm sure this was already fueled by a pre existing racial bias against Thanos for his appearance that was very disfigured, especially for a member of the Titan race. And so they had no problem exiling this person whom they viewed as being born bad and now having bad ideas because they allowed him to mature rather than killing him at birth. Whatever the case, the population collapse that he theorized came to pass, and Titan became naught but a desolate wasteland, a cautionary tale that Thanos would take with him for the rest of his life. In the comics, Thanos is somewhat different. He does want to exterminate half of all life in the universe, but sometimes he wants to exterminate all life in the universe, and his primary motivation in the comics is to serve the Lady Death, the female embodiment of death, whom he is in love with. And quite frankly, I like his MCU version way more than his comics version because, for one, he's not a stupid simp. I mean, they did allude to that in the post-credit scene of the Avengers, but that didn't really go anywhere. But more importantly, because I feel like his motivations and his goals within the MCU were actually far more compelling than simply wanting to kill people to impress a woman, which is quite frankly such a terrible motivation for a villain. And, well, we're not going to get into it. So I mentioned earlier that we would get into Malthus, and that's because Thomas Malthus, an English clerical philosopher and academic back in the I think around the 17th to 18th century, or perhaps let me check this right now, actually, because this time period, knowing the time period, I feel is important for important figures like Thomas Malthus. So he lived from 1766 to 1835 34. And he believed that the population growth of the entire planet would be very detrimental to our world's future, both the planet itself, called Earth, obviously, and the human population of Earth would suffer because there would be essentially boiling down a rather complex book that he wrote titled the essay on the principle of population. To boil down a very complex idea, he said that the population of Earth would outgrow the Earth government and political system's capacity to feed and sustain all these human bodies. And so eventually there would be some kind of catastrophic collapse, whether that be a response from nature, climate wise, or, riots and civil wars and generally just sort of battles and bloody struggles over a dwindling pocket of resources. Whatever the Whatever the case, Thomas Malthus predicted that there would be widespread famine and death. Of course, his predictions haven't come true yet, but now many people, as we go into 2025 and as we're heading into 2026 and the rest of this decade and the rest of these imminent decades, people are starting to maybe question that perhaps this guy was onto something after all. But whatever the case, Thanos is a very Malthusian character at heart. He is not evil innately, which is something you have to get across very unlike many other characters on this listing. He actually has an ideology which he believes will overall help the people that are survivors of his cataclysmic plans. In Avengers Endgame, after he realizes that the universe has rejected his ideals and the Avengers killed him and reversed everything he did, he decides simply to wipe out the pre existing universe and create a superior, better one, simply to worship him as a god. Of course, I don't really approve of that because that kind of derails from Thanos' initial ideas. I do respect it as a villain motivation, and I do approve of it as a villain motivation, but we're not really talking about that Thanos because that's an alternate version of Thanos, who is the main villain of Endgame, rather than Infinity War, which is the primary narrative we're focusing on here. So Thanos, a Malthusian character, genuinely did want to bring a better future for the universe through his massacres and through his genocidal plans, but also he had other endeavors going on which made you question his moral ambiguity a little bit because he did adopt Gamora after massacring her family. He did adopt Nebula after massacring her family, and he constantly tortured Nebula by replacing her body parts with robotic artifices and limbs and such like that whenever she lost a battle against Gamora. And he was clearly favoring Gamora over her, despite the fact that both of them unilaterally did not like Thanos and viewed him as an abusive, hateful father, rather than Gamora actually approving of his treatment and enjoying the preferential way that he looked upon her. Whatever the case, Thanos also recruited entire alien races to his cause. He recruited the mercenary Sakarans, an insectoid like race of killers and bounty hunters for hire that enjoyed murdering and slaughtering and laying their eggs in the corpses of their enemies. Freaky piece of lore there. The Chitauri, a lizard like race of people whom we can assume Thanos dominated by right of conquest by slaughtering the Chitauri leaders early on throughout his history as an intergalactic warlord. And the Outriders, a race of dog like creatures that were basically xenomorphs but way less dangerous and just, cannon fodder. We can assume that he tamed them similar to how the Covenant tamed the Hunters. We don't really know much about the history of Thanos with the Outriders. We can assume that a member of the Black Order maybe helped him in controlling these savage beasts, but whatever the case, they are now under his control. So Thanos has a sizable, very dangerous army, has a reputation as the most dangerous, feared being in the universe, and has an order called the Black Order of his most elite servants that go out and complete specialized missions for him, leading us to in the narrative of Infinity War, where he finally gathers all the stones after Ronan the Accuser and Loki both failed him very terribly, so he decides to personally go on a crusade to acquire all the stones and do the snap. He succeeds in the snap, and then in Endgame, Thor kills him after the whole "you should have gone for the head" thing, which is honestly pretty badass. So, all this in mind, what is Thanos' competency level? Guys, this video is going to be somewhat shorter than the usual villain competency tier list entries because, let's be honest, Thanos is the epitome of villain competency. He's manipulative, he's controlling, he thinks of backup plans for his backup plans, he knows what to say to get people on his side, he's charismatic. And he's physically quite powerful. He's very domineering. He has a huge presence. He can control armies of alien creatures and strong individuals and position them as pawns in order to enact his will. But most importantly, he has an unbreakable determination and willpower. He knows, to himself at least, he knows that he is right. It's not a question of if he is right. He knows that if the universe is allowed to outgrow its resource limitations, then it will collapse into nothingness and despair. He cannot allow the universe to follow the same fate as his beloved homeworld of Titan. So, whatever the case, Thanos will do everything in his power to ensure that the universe avoids that fate by gathering the fabled Infinity Stones. These ultra powerful artifacts that if virtually any other Marvel villain acquired them, like I'm talking like what if someone like Annihilus or just virtually any other villain period, what if someone like Palpatine acquired the Infinity Stones? They would use them to control, to dominate, to slaughter en masse. They would not care about any specific ideology of saving the universe. They would just do it to massacre and to control and to essentially make themselves into unbeatable gods. The moment that Thanos achieved what he wanted, he decided to get rid of the stones using their own power against them to essentially render them moot because he didn't need them anymore. And he did not like the temptation, the allure of power that the stones were giving him. Thanos never wanted to rule as a god over anyone, which is very ironic considering that's how many people throughout the universe, both ally and enemy, viewed him. Because the fact of the matter is, Thanos' personal goals were not of conquest. Every move he made as a warlord was not to secure more territory and own a region of space. Even when he was in that stage of his career, when he didn't have the stones yet, he was still building up his power, so he decided to secure various regions of space and act more like a political entity. When he was loaning out assistance to Ronan the Accuser, he was using the other to control people, his spokesperson, the other. And he was generally just doing things that a conventional type of evil warlord villain, such as Vilgax from Ben 10, for example, would be doing. Future tier century, actually. But he wasn't doing all that purely for that sake. He was not doing all of that acquiring power for power's sake. He was doing all that as a means to the final end of simply snapping his fingers with the Infinity Gauntlet. Now, Thanos was a bit hypocritical too, which might muddle with his competency a little bit because he says he wants to massacre half of all life. And, he does seem mostly consistent with that, but with the dwarves, the individuals who forged the Infinity Gauntlet Mjolnir and had the technology that helped Thor and friends create Stormbreaker, he was a bit more hypocritical and wiped out all the dwarves. Admittedly, that was fair because they could present a huge threat to his plans if he left all the dwarves alive, or at least even half the dwarves alive. What am I saying? To speak about his ambitions and the intricacies of what he created, the Infinity Gauntlet. But he still left the leader of the dwarves alive. I forget his name, Aetiri or something. So I don't really understand the point of all that. But besides all that, Thanos won. Yeah, you cannot say that for many villains on this tier list. Even the ones who did win, quote unquote, like Imran Zakayev, they kind of just win through their legacy of being seen as a hero to Russia or this ultra nationalist leader. The villains who did win in the narrative earlier on, like Court Prime, ultimately lose in the end and leave behind no legacy. People like Belos leave behind no legacy despite the fact that he was winning constantly and he was on top of the game for 50 plus years in the Boiling Isles. Palpatine is the only other comparable character so far on this tier list to Thanos because Palpatine did win. He won in an actual mainline piece of media. All of these other characters that I've listed so far in the S tier of my list win in the past. Their narrative legacies are forged in the past. We don't see them permanently winning, at least with them alive to see it. In Imran Zakayev's case, within the narrative, Zakayev is not alive to enjoy his martyrdom status within the Russian people. Belos, I mean, he leaves nothing behind because he's universally reviled as the most evil character in the Owl House to the point where even the Collector doesn't like him anymore. So he leaves nothing behind, even though he was a very successful villain. Only Palpatine not only left stuff behind, but also succeeded for an extended period of time. The Prophet of Truth, he won back in the day when he ascended to political control over the entire Covenant, but afterwards, throughout Halo 2 and 3, he just kept taking L after L until he finally perished. Wallace Breen, he was sandwiched in an unwinnable situation and basically just went kaput when Gordon Freeman finally caught up to him and destroyed his precious tower. Same with Horde Prime. He won in the past and had this intergalactic empire enforced by his legions of clones, but by the time of She-Ra, when we finally do see him, he is a menacing threat, but he does lose. The same goes for like Ozai, Megatron. Roose Bolton is a bit of an exception. We do see him win, but it's a very temporary win. And it's not even close comparably to the scale of Thanos' win, and his win had to be fueled by Lannister assistance for the most part. Carlton Drake is just, honestly, yeah, he's just a disposable henchman type figure. So, Thanos actually succeeded. He was resting on a retirement farm on some unknown planet after snapping his fingers and just enjoying the rest of his life looking upon a grateful universe. And you know the craziest part? His snap was actually working. It's mentioned in Avengers Endgame that the planet of Earth was actually healing resource wise, that, now people were seeing dolphins in the San Francisco Bay because the snap was actually alleviated the amount of overfishing that was going on regarding humans. Animal populations were actually healing despite the fact that half of them disappeared. Half of all life did not just feed human life. Thanos was not racially biased. He was not specifically targeting anyone specifically. He was going after half of all organic life, period. So that just meant anything that was being a strain on resources. So once that was gone, the other half could enjoy a prosperous future built off the sacrifices of what was lost, right? And we see in that Captain America show, I think it was whatever it was called, the one with Helmut Zemo. I'm forgetting the name, but there was a terrorist group called the Flag Smashers that actively wanted to bring back the post-blip world. Because in the post-blip world, the countries of Earth were forced to become more unified together because so much was lost. And because so much was lost, people were able to sort of come together and start rebuilding society in a more egalitarian and more helpful way, because humanity understood that in this time of great crisis we all needed to help each other. There was no one who was going to survive alone, with half their population, half of all life within their national border simply vanishing into non-existence and oblivion forever. And when the blip was reversed, because the Avengers decided they themselves could articulate the future of the universe and they themselves knew best, because, that's the standard arrogance of such pathetic, heroic individuals. The Flag Smashers and countless other people, I'm assuming, were pissed off because the world that was built was much better than the world that came back, right? Now, you can make many arguments against Thanos personally, against his philosophy, his ideology. This video is not for that. This video is simply to estimate his competency. And on the tier list, there is no way I can give Thanos anything less than, if plot armor didn't exist, they'd rule the universe. Because Thanos quite literally, in his own way, ruled the universe. He wasn't really ruling the universe as opposed to letting the universe rebuild itself on its own, but he could have ruled the universe in Avengers Endgame if his plan to simply destroy everything and rebuild it and have himself worshipped as a god who was enjoying the gratitude of all life because people were seeing him as the individual who brought everything to them succeeded. Of course, it didn't succeed, but that's the point. In Avengers Endgame, he was sort of becoming he was losing his sanity a bit because he saw that he did succeed, but then like the people rejected his solution, and so of course that would turn anyone mad. But it is what it is. So I'm gonna put Thanos in. I'm still uncertain of if I should put him above or below Palpatine. I think I'll put him below simply because of the fact that Thanos, after he died in Avengers Endgame, he never really came back in any conducive way. Palpatine survived for 3 generations of movies up until Episode 9. So he will still remain king of this list, but Thanos is like directly behind him because he did win. There's no doubt about it. He actually did succeed. And of course, plot armor and heroic antics that eventually undid everything that he sought to achieve. But in that brief 5-year period, everything was perfect, at least for him. And that, my friends, is the mark of a truly great villain. I'll see you all in the next